we don't have a model for orality without memory. So oral cultures in the past we know they had higher memory capacities than we do. That's why we have literature from like 300 years after it was composed orally. Our oral culture today will be an ahistorical one because we do not have the memory capacity anymore for traditional oral cultures. I remember when I was in North Africa and I'd meet kids who could memorize the entire Quran without even understanding what it meant. I was thinking about this in terms of orality now. And I don't want to sound like a doomsday prepper, but in some ways it really is bad because oral cultures in the past had high executive function loads and high memory capacities, and we have neither. We have lost those skills. We could give them back, but not using the technology that we're using. Plato was not wrong that the book lowered our memory capacity. He was absolutely correct. I mean, the scroll at the time. But the trade-off was worth it. Today, I do not know that the trade-off is worth it.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, joined, as with most episodes, George Hoare in London.
Hello.
Who was able to keep the lights on still just about, as you may
keep some of the lights on.
Keep some of the lights
at a low wattage. That's not a metaphor. That's
no high wattage podcasting, but low wattage illumination. And very happy to welcome on the podcast for the first time, very belated invitation to see Derick Varn. Hello. For those who don't know him, he is a poet, a podcaster, and a teacher. And that last bit is what we're particularly interested in because he's a teacher who's taught in Mexico, Korea, Egypt, Southeastern US, the Western US, and has apparently taught at every level from 6th grade US, so that's like 12 years old or so, all the way to postgraduate programs. And this is what we're going to be talking about today, about the post-literate society. Let me just set this up a little bit with some facts, if you'll bear with me. I'm going to quoting a little bit liberally from something that contributing editor Lee Jones drafted for other purposes, but it's called Why I Ask Students Not to Use Electronic Devices in Class or When Preparing for Class. There's extensive anecdotal evidence today of the negative impact of the use of laptops, tablets, and smartphones in lectures and seminars, particularly in terms of students' engagement with the material and one another. Moreover, there's now also extensive scientific evidence that despite a growing mania for e-learning, technology use has no appreciable positive impact on student learning and indeed actually damages it. There's also now a large base of scientific evidence that the use of electronic devices coupled with the internet is affecting the brain structure of young people, harming their ability to concentrate and process information. There's also mounting evidence that the use of generative AI, including chatbots like ChatGPT, is destroying human beings' intellectual and social capacities, while being a less accurate replacement for them. According to this is separately, but some other facts and figures to throw at you, listener, and I hope your numeracy levels are up there with your literacy and comprehension skills to follow along. Sorry to patronize you, that's a joke. According to a massive OECD study from 2023, in-person assessments of the literacy, numeracy, and problem-solving skills of 160,000 adults aged 16 to 65 in 31 different countries and economies found that compared with the last set of assessments a decade earlier, the trends in literacy skills were striking. Proficiency improved significantly in only 2 countries, Finland and Denmark, remained stable in 14 and declined significantly in 11, with the biggest deterioration in Korea, Lithuania, New Zealand, and Poland, rather different countries one from the other. Other little bits of data, 30% of Americans now read at a level you would expect from a 10-year-old child, and reading for pleasure has fallen by 40% in the US over the last 20 years. Finally, according to the Monitoring the Future study, which has been asking 18-year-olds whether they have difficulty thinking, concentrating, or learning new things, has found that those answering positively has increased rapidly from the mid-2010s on. All this combined with a lot of people feeling that they're just at a very anecdotal or personal level, that they're spending too much time on their phones and probably don't read enough. And this is a feeling, I think, amongst the intelligentsia themselves, not just the population at large, has generated this discourse around a post-literate society. So we want to inquire into that, and very happy to have Derick on to help us talk this through. So I guess
before we get started, I do generally agree with Lee, but I just wonder how he drafted this. He presumably used an electronic device to write this and to circulate it. So I agree with his sentiment more than his
but
practice.
Lee's very smart. He doesn't have to write by hand. He can type it out. He's allowed to get away with that.
One rule for them, for thee, and another for me. That's what it seems like to me.
Anyway, so Derick, first of all, I mean, this is really perhaps a dumb question, but maybe necessary. What is literacy? Like, what are we talking about here?
That actually is not a dumb question. One of the things that we have to deal with is literacy has been an expanding metaphor for every kind of competency that we can think of. So you hear about media literacy, you hear about technological literacy. Part of that is because almost all of them are based on literacy itself. So by that, I mean, it's all based on symbolic decoding of language. And numeracy, which is a different kind of literacy, is still based off that. It's still decoding symbols and figuring out what the symbols and signs are. The overlaps in the brain are pretty profound between literacy and numeracy, even though there are areas of the brain that one will light up and the other won't when looking at it in a CT scan. So there's all kinds of interesting things to deal with that. I, however, will tell you all forms of literacy and numeracy are declining, including technological literacy. We have data on that too. One of the issues is new user interfaces are so seamless that students don't know how to type anymore. They're only used to navigating with their thumbs. That you'll hear people say that students are digital natives. They're not. They only really know how to use smartphones. We see all these trends in general in education right now. Confoundingly, in the United States at least, we also see a rise in graduation rates. So what that tells you is increasingly we're relying on secondary education for what would be post-secondary education for what would be basic literacy. So stuff that now you have to pay for yourself. The reasons for that are complicated, and this isn't universally true. So if you'll forgive my American centricism for the second, but I have seen similar trends in other Anglo countries. England is not that different here. The pressure on graduation rates as opposed to testing has led to finding alternate ways to get kids to graduate. Sometimes that is as little as having them take a test, just like you would a GED here in the States. So that's a general education equivalency test. One of the things about those general education equivalency tests, though, is that they have always been a little bit lower than the actual standards for these grade levels. So it's part of why they've never been seen as truly equivalent. Like, yeah, you get your GED, people will hire you, it proves you've done something, but you really aren't able to do everything you would have done if you had completed every grade to spec. But increasingly, they're not even pushing that. They're pushing internal to the graduation system, testing out of classes, taking packets, which are take-home, just packets of paper that kids can do on their own, unsupervised, to get credit. Online classes, which unfortunately now is what I teach. You'll hear me today talk about a lot about teaching technology and the business end of that, because it has become a massive rent-seeking business. But simultaneously, you're right, there's no evidence that it does anything. And in fact, if you look at John Hattie's meta-analysis, the analysis is technology in general has no effect whatsoever, But then specific technologies such as blue screens and stuff have negative effects. So it tells you that whatever gains are made by tech are offset by the losses. And yet they're being pushed everywhere. I mean, across the board. I think it's only really super elite schools that don't push them. And they did for a while. So when I was teaching in Egypt, I was teaching at IB schools, very elite schools. I taught diplomats' kids. And those technology things were being forced upon them by American and British accreditors.
Mm.
Similarly now, I mean, we are having debates trying to keep AI out of our standards. And I have people who I work for in a public school system who really believe that kids do not need to read because the AI will do it for them. I have had a conversation with technology specialists in education who increasingly have power in the system because it's a way that schools can get money, who really push this view of a post-literate future for their own students. When I point out that even by their logic, that means that their students aren't employable, because why would a business hire them if AI can do everything? Now, I actually realize as a Marxist, it's really not that simple, but like just using their own logic, and I get no response. The situation's quite bad. So what is literacy? Literacy is the ability to decode symbols and make sense of them in a coherent way. Most of us are verbally literate, you know. Now, there's all different kinds of ways to measure literacy, and I'll get into some of the things that have been used by professors to kind of distract from the fact that there's a literacy problem. Because one of the weird things that you'll see right now is higher education in particular making excuses for this as if nothing's going on. That is actually pretty much the default standard. You go look at like higher ed today, and you'll see them like, oh, it's not really a problem. They've been doing this since the aughts, since the first studies on declines in adult reading across the board hit the shelves, I think around 2004, 2005. And the initial response was, oh, well, people are reading less books, but they're reading more internet. But that hasn't been true since about 2017.
Right.
Since visual internet's now the dominant form of internet engagement, by that I mean videos for the most part.
Yeah, like it's gone from like X and Facebook posts to TikTok or whatever, right?
Right. And, you know, you've gone from blogs to Facebook posts to X to TikTok. And in each step, you see a declining of complexity of language.
So what is like on the part of maybe not so much the university administrators or whatever, but the people who are pushing the technology and think, well, you can just have AI do the reading and writing for you. What is their, maybe to put it in terms which they certainly wouldn't think of, but like what is their vision of Bildung? You know, what is like the self-development? Like what? So basically, so people are no longer having to read and write because the AI does it for them. What are people doing instead? Like at least, you know, in their perspective, like, or is it just
complaining about his teachers' hostility to technology?
I don't think these people have a concept of Bildung. Really.
No, but that's my interpretation. But okay, what are you doing just basically simply like what are you spending your time doing at work or in your life if you're no longer having to read and write? Like what do they have? Is that box filled in with any sort of detail, or is it just like
no? And you're not seeing a return to vocational education either. So it's not like they're advocating that we teach students more practical skills. Again, they seem to think that AI is going to take all that off. Now, I will tell you that, and I'm going to almost sound conservative here for a second, but educational technology specialists on the public side aren't necessarily the most impressive bunch because the private sector would pay them astronomically more than the public sector would. That's not true for a lot of teachers, but it is definitely true for tech specialists in education. Now, there are some people who go into it for, you know, noble reasons, but also if you're a classroom teacher and you need to get promoted, the only ways you can get promoted in most school systems in the West, anyway, this is actually not as true in Asia, is to go into administration. And the fastest growing area of administration is like digital literacy and and an ed tech specialist. And you can even get the state to pay for that because there's a lot of incentives for that. I recently went to a conference which was basically a giant corporate ad for big tech selling AI as actual human cognition, that the school districts paid $2,000 a person roughly to send people to for just a giant ad. The administrative cost of education has gone up dramatically, and people know about this in higher ed, but they don't seem to understand this in lower ed. And a lot of the growth is tech consultants, literacy consultants. It's not site principals, which is what people think is going on. It's not like we have more administrators doing that. In fact, those administrators do less and less of what we think of administration doing. So instead of doing like discipline and whatnot, they're more political actors who interface with the public, and they just keep monitoring our integration of technology and new pedagogy consulting systems into our classroom. And there's literally no evidence that any of it has done anything good at all.
And now there's enough of a kind of record. I mean, you've probably got, a good 10 years of this stuff, right? Like it's not like there's not a body of evidence that's there. In fact, the stuff that I quoted from at the beginning points to quite a lot of studies pointing that this stuff doesn't actually work. So what, I guess, George, I don't know if you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, I mean, I've got quite a few thoughts on on this sort of stuff. I guess, like, obviously literacy, and as you were saying, is like, the ability to read and write. This is can you process things as an individual? What proportion of people are literate, are numerate? These are important social facts. If they reach a certain level, if they decline to a certain level, then a society is post-literate. But I was also thinking that there are elements of literacy in particular that seem to be kind of larger than the individual. So there's something about discretion or being able to make a judgment, but perhaps distinguishing something that should be censored from something that shouldn't be. But more than that, and this is E.D. Hirsch. If I think listeners will have heard me mention this name before, an American educationalist influenced by Gramsci, not the only one. His idea was that to be a literate society, you have to have, and this is taken straight from Gramsci, you have to have a certain set of core knowledge, or you have to have familiarity, not necessarily with the canon, but with the references that make up a newspaper. Because to be an active political subject, you need to be able to participate in political conversations, in political arguments. And this kind of, if a society doesn't have this kind of common store of knowledge, if it doesn't have this kind of core knowledge, as Hirsch puts it, then in some ways it is a post-literate society, because you cannot have those conversations. So literacy is both a skill, or not only a skill, but it's also familiarity with a set of knowledge. And that knowledge is, is social, is political, is historical. And Hirsch gives this good example of like, and this is against progressive educators who say, everything's a skill. We should do skill-based education. That's bullshit. Like, you need domain-specific knowledge in order to do things. You can only have a certain amount of working memory to progress in maths, for example. But Hirsch has this good example of like reading a report on a baseball game. Like, you need to know like the basic rules of baseball. Otherwise, you're just never going to be able to you can have critical reading skills, but that's not going to really cut it. You just got to tell people, this is how baseball works. This is what the references are, and apply that to history. Hirsch found that a lot of his students didn't know basic things about the American Civil War, which maybe I don't know either. But I know things about the English Civil War. I know that Civil War pretty well. So yeah, I guess I was just sort of thinking that like sometimes the excessive focus on literacy rates hides this kind of what I think is a kind of a deeper political question about whether, as societies, we are committed to identifying a core of important knowledge, defending it and transmitting it to the next generation. And that is the kind of older socialist educational project which I think has been completely forgotten and displaced by this Rousseauian progressive nonsense. But anyway, I'm sounding like
no, but can I just ask? I want to ask
you
a question
when discussing this. I think
I want to ask a question just because I don't know this area at all, really. I mean, to push back on what George was saying, isn't there? And Derick do come in here after me. But is there not, does that acculturation, for lack of a better word, come through other means? Like that's not law, like literacy rate in a kind of formal skills-based sense is declining because people can read text but maybe not understand them. People can't write, syntactically coherent sentences, etc. But surely, knowing the rules of baseball and kind of these references can be imbibed from other sources, and that maybe that isn't, that's not a problem.
That's an interesting question. So one thing we have been paying attention to is what we might call pre-education literacy rates, which have been declining. So students come to us with less knowledge of like basic alphabet and basic decoding. Now, parents are not literacy specialists. They're not supposed to be literacy specialists, either culturally or otherwise. But it's an absolute truth that most of these cultural things that Hirsch was trying to get us to do in education were also socially embedded in ways that they are not now. And one of the things I will say that's going to make people uncomfortable is there is no way to fix education without also fixing the larger societal context in which it exists in. And that requires making normative judgments and decisions that people do not want to do. I'll give you an example of this. Freddie DeBoer talks about this. It's not the same thing as the cultural literacy you're talking about, but I'll tie it back in. There's been a pushback on standardized testing in most of the Western world, and particularly the United States, but it's both liberal and conservative. Their justifications for pushing it back are different. The conservative one is that it's a bureaucratic state overreach. The liberal one is that it's racist. There is a sense in which the liberal critique is true in that every time you give an assessment, you have to pick a language that it give the assessment in. And I don't just mean like English. I mean, you have to pick a register, a standard register. You have to pick a standard set of cultural competencies, etc. And if you are marginalized and you don't make a separate test that's equivalent, and it's hard to know if you are making an equivalent test, there are cultural biases that come in. The thing is, if you look at the research, Freddie DeBoer has talked about this, but I've talked about this too. Everything that liberals wish to replace those systems with have a known quantity of being more arbitrarily racist. Grades. I can tack grades to attractiveness level, and skin tone and addresses more than I can test scores, which means they're more classist, a term I hate, but I'm going to use here, and racist than standardized testing. But you don't have to deal with that. And by the way, if people go like in America, if we just get more African-American teachers or whatever, this will go away. Those biases are replicated in minority teaching groups too. Which tells you that what you're dealing with is something larger than the expression given. Now, when it comes to cultural context, to tie this back into what George said, you have to make a call about what to include and not include. In the 1990s and aughts, when I was coming into education, I was all about expanding the canon. Literally, I was like, okay, let's just include more. What I was not about, but has been the way this has been interpreted, is like, well, there's only so much you can teach, so we're going to teach less, and so we're gonna pick, Alice Walker over Aristotle. All right. Well, eventually the kids don't read Alice Walker either. All right. I remember arguing with some anarchists who were expressing a common sentiment in progressive education that even things like Franz Fanon, which, I don't think leads to the miraculous things that a lot of leftists think it would, but that's not here or there, it was racist to ask people to read that. All right. To ask people to read Black literature, because it was still in a European language and a European canon, even though it was, Black authors that we were talking about. And I was like, well, then what's the purpose of education then? Like, so what you see is this idea that We don't need to do primary direct instruction. We do. But that direct instruction will not stick unless it is also reinforced outside of the classroom. And are ways that even seemingly progressive ways like Stuart Hall's explicitly teaching code switching, etc., have been turned on by progressives because, why should anyone need to code switch? Like you should meet people where they're at. And I'm like, well, no one's going to actually do that. They don't do it. That's never been how things worked ever. And it's not even true for, quote, white people, unquote, like that they don't have to code switch. I know that I have to talk in a different register when I go back home to my blue collar family than when I'm dealing with academics. It's just something you have to do. This has baffled me about particularly the left on this issue, because even Marxists have accepted a lot of progressive education myths. And I point out that neither China nor Russia did any of that shit. Like, they did do stuff like Vygotsky's, zones of proximal development. They did stuff about social learning. They talked about social reinforcement of learning outside of education. That's absolutely true that they did. But they did not think that you didn't have to include a corpus of common references. They did not think that you should not teach different code switching. Even during the periods in the USSR where they weren't pushing Russification, you were still teaching both cultural competencies. And I mean, the education system in Russia and China were frankly miracles compared to what was there before. And yet that's not what most modern leftists base their educational ideas on. And frankly, it would be better in some ways if they did accept classical education and just broadened out what that meant with classical education for different parts of the world, then it would be for them to continue down the current path they're doing. Because my students, like, it's not just my students in the classroom. I consider my podcast an educational project, and it's not related to my day job at all, but it is an educational project. And the frame of references that the people complain about me bringing up are the terminology that I bring up that I always feel like, oh, you're talking over the head of the workers. And I'm like, I come from a blue collar background. My father was a mechanic. My mother was a waitress turned nurse. They all read. My grandfather had an 8th grade education, and yes, he mostly read the Bible, but he also read like 19th century literature for fun as a brickmaker. Now, that was a miracle of 20th century literacy. And in the United States, the big jump in literacy is between the Civil War and World War II. Literacy rates have been mostly stagnant since the achievement of universal education in the 1970s. And they only started going down recently, but there was not that many gains. The gains were only kind of the closing of the gap between Black and white students. And unfortunately, the basic literacy rates between both were largely the same after 1970, but there was a gap in reading ability. What people didn't really look at is some of that gap was closed by white students getting worse. Black students did get better, but not the gap was mutually shrinking. It wasn't just raising. So you saw Black students achieve, and this is actually during the period of the racist testing. After that was over, we've seen no gains whatsoever anywhere. Now, you will see some optimists point out that, like, well, literacy has increased dramatically since 1820. And I'm like, okay, but you're dealing with a population that was only about 50% literate. And a lot of the estimates of illiteracy prior to us keeping records in it in the universal school system had frankly been shown to be overblown. Like there's a lot more evidence that in the late medieval period and whatnot, basic literacy. Now, I don't mean like they weren't reading novels, but basic literacy was a lot more common than people think. And definitely by the time you have mass printing, that we really didn't take that long to hit 50% literacy in the early modern period. That to me indicates that there's been a massive failure. Now, we mentioned the technologies, but I just want to say blue screen technology problems goes back to television. We've known about it since the 1990s. And it wasn't from computers, it was from television that we actually learned that it lowers executive function. The average executive function time, I think in the 1970s was about 30 minutes. When I started teaching in the 2000s, it's about 15 minutes. Now it's about 3.
So, I mean, there's a tendency, obviously, to talk about this as a problem of education or the education system. And obviously, you've already said that, it's kind of a wider social problem. But also, I mean, just with regard to the education, I think it's worth asking, pointing to the fact that this seems to be happening across a whole range of different countries. And then, I mean, then that would, and these things are managed in different ways. Obviously, the administration of education systems have different priorities, although there are, of course, kind of worldwide trends, or kind of trends across the West, at least, which have changed education in certain ways. I think people generally will jump to then, the technology as an answer to the question, like, well, if it's global, but all these education systems are really different in Korea versus New Zealand versus the US versus Germany, that it must then be technology. I mean, do you have a kind of count for this on a kind of more global level? At least in terms of, literacy rates declining as measurable quantities across in different regions, different countries.
Well, I'm going to put on my vulgar Marxist hat for a second, but I actually am going to say changes in the way production is organized probably also contribute to this. So most work today is only semi-social. And by that, I mean, it's like service work, which is social on a small scale, but it's social in the way you interact with the customers. It's not necessarily super social in the way you interact with your coworkers. Increasingly, factory productivity is highly isolated and automated in ways that make factory cooperation less and less obvious and necessary. And then you have the prevailing gig economy, which is a realm of hyper internal competition, which both decreases leisure time, even if you have, and this gets complicated because there's actually also some evidence that people work less than they did in earlier time periods, particularly in the quote working class unquote, but that their time is more consumed with things around work and decompressing from work and the alienation tied to work in ways that we did not see in the early 20th century. So I think it's a 1-2 punch. You have atomization in work, which lowers your zone of proximal intelligence, because one thing that I will say that you'll get from Soviet pedagogy is that intelligence is socially encouraged. It is not an individual thing. Yes, there's a difference in individual intelligence, but there's stunning things that you can see on things like IQ scores, which I know it's not popular to talk about. And I think one of the reasons why it's not popular to talk about is the developed world actually has had a reverse Flynn effect. If you don't know what the Flynn effect is, in the 20th century, every decade, the IQ raised between 3 and 10 points on average. All right. So actually, weirdly, IQ started below the 100 average set point and has now the average went up to about 110, 117, somewhere in there. In the 21st century, even countries like Norway have seen aggregate IQ declines. But if you were to take a person from, say, sub-Saharan Africa and have them integrate into a Western country, you will see their IQ go up, which indicates both that IQ, even though it has heritable, maybe genetic components, is very plastic when you change social context. But that also leads us to having a hard time to explain the complex social complex that led to a decline in IQ. And I just hate to tell everyone, it's about the time we saw declines in IQ where everybody turned against IQ. Now, I don't think IQ measures every kind of intelligence. I really don't. It doesn't measure cultural competency. It doesn't measure certain kinds of spatial awareness. It measures abstract logical reasoning only. But that is a measurement of something. And while I'll admit, like I admitted in the beginning, that every time you pick a test, you have to pick a common language for the test, blah, 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 and that has cultural and racial implications, I have worried that in general there's been an ignoring of this fact when it comes to trying to monitor these things. Now, to bring your point about this being across the board, some of the places that do the best on these kind of tests, like the PISA test, which is the international test, like Korea, have seen the largest declines in literacy. Other places, as much as Europeans like to make fun of Americans being stupid, there actually is an indication that adult people in the States read at a slightly higher level on average than, say, adult French people, which really goes against stereotypes. Where Americans really, really, really show major deficits internationally is actually in math and numeracy. But on scientific literacy and we are about the OECD average for adults. Now, we're not the OECD average for children, which also leads a bunch of different questions to kind of figure that out. So it is true that the United States tends to be in the lower half of the participants in the OECD, but it is not true that they are markedly lower than most of Europe. I think we do score slightly higher than France and Italy, and slightly lower than the UK, depending on the year. There's been years where we've been higher than the UK. Now, I will tell you that I think the UK education system is slightly better than the US's education system, but only slightly, and they have similar trends and problems in related to this development in education. The other thing that we'll see is the older your public education system is, the harder it is to get any gains. Right. So there's all that, but if you look at I think the United States is 14th in literacy skills out of 31 in the OECD, but and that's bad because the US likes to think of itself as number one in everything. But if you actually think about where we're at, we're like slightly above France and slightly below the UK. We're not actually that statistically off. We're way below Canada.
So,
but yeah.
One thing I wanted to bring in, and particularly this is visible in the British context, like why are we seeing like a moving backwards in literacy rates? Like books are more easily available than ever, so much investment in education systems. I think part of it is I don't want to sound too reactionary here, or maybe I do. Like part of it is like a hatred of Western civilization, the feeling that there is no knowledge worth defending, and the collapse of liberalism. I mean, there's a story in Britain recently that Shakespeare's birthplace is to be decolonized after white supremacy fears. So this trust in Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare was born, warned that his genius could be seen as a symbol of British cultural superiority. And then this is, I think, very widespread, the reduction of education to a social mobility mechanism, the complete instrumentalization of knowledge. So literature is used to teach politics. There's no, as I said, no ability to defend. This is what's valuable about our civilization. You should read Paradise Lost, whether it might be difficult or not, just because it's beautiful and it's part of being human. That, all of these things collapsing means that, why should people invest their time, reading for pleasure? Like the decline of this in America in some ways makes sense, because there is no authority in this kind of inherited cultural legacy, this kind of passing down of valuable knowledge. And this is a much more widespread social problem than just the education system. Or Gramsci would argue this, that his approach to this is that education is not just in the education system. It includes obviously the school and the university, but also things like parliament, penal system, political parties, unions, churches, radio, theatre, museums, even architecture and urbanism. All of these things, I think, in different ways have essentially, and I've made this point on the podcast before, you see a process whereby the inherited authority in the collected knowledge of these institutions is undermined for short-term gain, particularly recently by people who are operating in these institutions. So, for example, the editing industry and these cultural sensitivity readers who've taken over. And shout out to any any insensitivity readers out there, such as Nina Power, friend of the show. That's how she styles herself. But these are part of the wider educational apparatus. Like all of these things, they're serious. Like there is no, like, where is this kind of, and I think it is unavoidable to sound in some ways conservative, because you are trying to conserve the best of that's been thought and said, as some guy put it previously, because this is the kind of store of knowledge that you want, particularly students who don't maybe get it at home, to receive in the school system, and that to be reinforced by all these other things which interlock. So I mean, I just think it is such a, like, literacy rates are the kind of are a symptom, and they are like not unimportant, but the rot is pretty deep. I don't I have my own solutions, but they're not straightforward, and it's because I think ultimately it is a political problem. It is about the crisis for authority, as you may or may not be surprised to hear me conclude, Alex. But like, yeah, I think that it's the impulse is to say, and I think this is an important impulse, that like, yeah, we do need to do more traditional education. We do need to identify this knowledge and to kind of to have a curriculum, to have textbooks in schools. That is the only educational technology you need. You need a textbook and a teacher and a blackboard. I don't you don't need to reinvent the wheel here, and invest some authority in the person of the teacher. They're not the guide on the side. They're the sage on the stages, as progressive educationalists tend to put it in, like there's something wrong with that. This is what, there is a dialectic of conformity and spontaneity in education. Students are there to be molded, and we've kind of lost that kind of, I guess, willingness to socialize the younger generation, and that's not their fault. That's ours. Bad news. Bad news for them, but it's our fault.
I would say I would probably complicate that quite a bit, but I would agree that the first thing that you should never do as a teacher is let students think you are their peer, because even if you want them to be your peer, they have to accept you as a way to guide them. I think the whole binary between sage on the stage and guide on the side is foolish, frankly. And if anything, I would also tend towards saging on the stage. But I do have to teach my students how to do certain things beyond lecture. One of the things I think that you get to, and I wanted to come back to this, and maybe you'll like this and maybe you won't, but I can't even complicate the narrative, because believe it or not, a lot of the progressive anti-Western hatred stuff that you guys are talking about is based off of normalizing and accepting as true 19th century bullshit in the first place. So for example, I was listening to someone lecture about Christian history, and they called Anastasius a white Christian. Now, for those of you who don't know, Anastasius is from Northern Africa. It's just not meaningful to talk about someone from Northern Africa as white or not. When we talk about Egyptians, skin tone only gets brought up in like the 6th century, and only in the crisis in the Roman Empire. Otherwise, they tend not to mention it at all. When you see people bring up racial codes in ancient Greece, and they try to read them onto modern racial codes, like, oh, the Greeks thought that, there were white and yellow people and black people. And I'm like, yeah, but they were defining it by hair color and by whether or not you spoke Greek. It's just not our code. It's a kind of way of categorizing people that barely existed. Yes, you can trace certain things and find it emerging over time in the late medieval period, but it's pretty anachronistic to read the ancient world that way. However, I can't teach kids that. All right? Because getting into that would offend everybody. If you say thinking about Aristotle as white is ahistorical, both sides of the aisle, because they're in a mutually reinforcing constitutive feedback loop, will just reject you out of hand, right? But it doesn't make sense to talk about someone from ancient Anatolia living in the Greek peninsula as white. Yeah. It doesn't make sense to comment on the Roman Empire as European. Most of it wasn't in Europe. In fact, the whole concept of Europe is a post-Christian, like post Ottoman invasion concept. But again, if you reject if you reject like these narratives of whiteness, but say basically they're true, and we should go study like I don't know indigenous culture in Africa. The problem is we don't have a lot of evidence for a lot of it, and you're basically basing it off of pre-literate evidence that you can project upon. Same, unfortunately, with a lot of indigenous cultures in the Americas, which is not to devalue this stuff from an anthropological scale, but these fads in activism actually do shape research in detrimental ways. This is one thing where I also sound like a conservative. I'll give you an example. Anyone who studies anthropology will tell you that the concept of cultural appropriation doesn't make any sense. You're going to have a hard time finding a singular origin for any cultural practice that you can claim belongs to a singular society. Sure. Like if you talk about African American culture in the Southeast, it's a mixture of like Yoruba, Islamic, and West British Isles culture, right? It just is. Like there's things like jumping the broom and stuff that come from Europe. It's a hybrid culture because of the interaction of the lower classes in the Southeast. Another example of that would be the much demonized y'all. I'm a Southerner. Y'all is really seen as low class, partly because it's association with Black people, but also partly because it's association with poor whites, even though in the 19th century, it was the standard U plural, of which American English no longer has a standard U plural. And so trying to get people to understand the way these things, quote, intersect is hilarious to me because it's usually the intersectionalists who don't want to deal with it.
Right. Yeah. But so, I mean, is there a tension between what you both are saying? I mean, to me, it sounds like you're talking along the same lines.
I think that I think the tension is not so much that we shouldn't have a culture. It's that there's a way that we can talk about these cultures that would include, like for example, the idea that when we talk about the West, we exclude the Islamicate world is kind of ridiculous to me, because I'm like, the only reason we have a lot of ancient Greek literature is interaction with the Islamicate world. It is effectively a Western culture. Now there is a pretty decisive line between Islamic culture and like say Protestant culture, but they're very related and similar to Catholic and not Catholic. But again, you have to have cultural literacy to know that. Like, and this goes to teaching facts, like even stuff like religious facts. Trying to explain to people that there is no concept of the European until Christendom is over, and that really is tied to the fall of Constantinople, is a fact that you have to contextualize to understand European history and thus understand post-European history in the Americas and its relation to whiteness or whatever. But there is a tendency, and I guess this is where I'm going to agree with George, there's a tendency to speak about this in ahistorical terms. You know, whiteness emerges and then it ruins everything. Okay, but what did it emerge from? Why did it emerge? Why is it a bigger deal in the Americas than it is in Europe, actually? I mean, like what British people are racist about and what Americans are racist about is actually somewhat mutually incomprehensible, even though lately you guys use our terms in racial categories, which makes no sense to me because you don't have the same conceptions. Go ahead.
Well, George, do you want to exclude the Islamic world? I ask as if I'm a TV panel news host. Yeah. And I don't understand if there. Sorry, I don't understand if there is a divergence in what you both are saying. To me, it sounds. I mean,
no, I think there maybe is a lot of agreement. I guess. Do I want to exclude? I think the canon should be smaller. Like this is one thing that's probably not going to make me a great deal of friends, but like the canon should be smaller. Like we should be more discriminating. It should just be like the creme de la creme. Because otherwise it's too, it is too much. So I think there is that kind of self-confident society that's able to say, like, essentially, here is the starting point of what is our national culture, what you need to know in order to have both of those two things at the same time, the ability to be an active political citizen and access to truth and beauty. Like that is I think it's a sign of a very unself-confident society that adds too many things to the canon and says, like, basically, we want to be accessible, we want to be open. In fact, it is a process of distinction and discrimination in specific meanings of both of those two senses, to say, well, actually, you don't. I'm wondering which kind of author from the 19th century to throw out. I'm not going to throw out Hardy or Eliot, because I know people who listen to this podcast would physically attack me if I did, and also like both of them. But yeah, they're you've got to be able to say some things are like overrated from the vantage point of later history, and I think that is one thing which we don't really seem to be able to do. So yeah, I'm so that's maybe my kind of not trying to be like flippant or provocative or contrarian about it, but I actually do think there's something in that kind of the process of common agreement around the canon is we're so far from being able to have that, and that is that's only one aspect of setting a curriculum, but it's a particularly indicative one, because it's not like chemistry. You can see how these different models of atoms kind of build on each other and complicate, and this is the state of the science, but you don't really have that with regard to literature. So yeah, I guess that's why I'm going to make I'm not saying that the things that excluded from the canon burn those books. I should just be clear, but more discrimination and more like
shoot them out of the canon. Yeah,
instead of a cannon, a gun. I don't know. Reduce the caliber, something like that. I need to work on the branding of this a little bit, perhaps.
In one sense, I would agree with you. Not to talk over Alex, but in one sense, I would agree with you. I will say, however, in a country like the United States, good damn luck. We have never had a really consistent canon. We're not a unified culture. We really haven't ever been. Our unifying culture is a media culture. It's a culture of mass media. It's not. There's no like common. We don't even have a common literature, really. We have regional literature, very regional literature. And that makes total sense when you think about the size of our country. But like what I would have been taught as canon in the Southeast is very different than what you'd be taught as canon in the Northeast, which is very different than what you'll be taught as canon in the West. And I've taught in two different regions of the United States, and I actually brought that up for that reason. It is significantly different. So, I guess I become kind of a vulgar Marxist and say, well, that's nice, but there is a political economic reason why that's so hard to do. It's not just a cultural one. And I'll leave it at that.
That being what? The political,
smaller canons are easier to do when you have a relatively homogenous Republican society in a relatively small area.
Right.
Like,
I don't know. The US seems pretty homogenous to me. I always think I'm like, yeah. But again, it's a common media culture. I agree with you there that there's no kind of like pre mass media substrate or even kind of a substrate which pertains to purely print media, but anyway,
the generic U.S. culture is because we're the hegemon of capitalism, and our regional dominance has set. It's a unholy mixture of the upper mid-Atlantic, which is the area between D.C. and New York, and the West, and not even the West Coast, specifically California, specifically LA. And, I think of cores and peripheries in the United States, where those are our cultural cores. And the thing is, any regional literatures we have here don't really matter anymore. Like I teach Black literature, I teach Southern literature, I used to teach a lot of these things. I've taught literature of the West. They have so little influence in our media culture that they're almost incomprehensible to students today. So I do think you're right that we're homogenized now. But if we had to decide a canon, really, if we had to decide a canon other than like the script for a capitalist workplace, I think you would immediately see cultural fractures that are pretty profound and deep, and would not be easily reconciled. And that may be true for England too. Or for maybe not for England, but definitely for the UK. But we wouldn't even agree where to, yes, we all like Shakespeare. Yes, we all speak English, but we would not have the same canon. Like, we don't give a shit about Milton. Like, just like, just straight up, we don't. It's never been. It is not part of our cultural legacy, despite our Protestant heritage. You know, and these are things that it's hard to get around. I agree with you today, though. Like, if you go get an English degree, what are you getting it in? Like, what is an English degree?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm repeating myself, but like, I think this is like the other side of the kind of conversation on literacy rates, that we're not, you know, we don't have the ability to say, here is the reason to read. Here is like the things that you can know about your society through the medium of these, you know, challenging, more or less challenging old books. And I think, you know, we talked about on this podcast quite a lot about the, you know, the movement from the nation state to the member state, or the kind of, you know, how do we constitute the nation? And, you know, maybe part of that is, I think it probably comes later. I think if you can politically constitute the nation, then the kind of like the culture of it probably comes after. I don't think you can probably do it the other way around. If you were just able to set the perfect kind of syllabus, everybody reads it, and then they become a kind of democratic, nationalist, Republican, or whatever.
This kind of comes to the point of, yeah, sorry to talk over you, George. This comes to the point of, and maybe just two more points, I think, before we finish. But one about whether this is a pre-political or a political matter. And we can talk about that both in terms of the kind of causes of post-literacy, but also in terms of the consequences or the ways about going about fixing it. I think something that, Derick, you talking earlier made me think, I mean, is that both liberals and conservatives have treated education as a soft target to kind of pursue political ends, and have done that for a long time, particularly as society itself seems immobile and polarized, or unable to kind of actually achieve any kind of change in one direction or another. And, you know, this is reflected in kind of national parliaments and governments. And, you know, education's a soft one that you can do, and probably to the detriment of education from both sides, because the conservatives haven't been interested in conserving really, and the liberals or progressives certainly not either. So with George's comments there, I think do make me think that, you know, in a certain sense, the education problem won't be resolved purely through education either. But it's unclear where the forces for kind of refounding a humanist education actually come from today. I wanted to kind of maybe tease out what are the consequences. I mean, if we're becoming an oral culture, and I don't know if that's a premise that you agree with, but if we're becoming an oral culture again, what are the consequences of that? Because it seems that one of the facets of a post-literate society is a society in which people thinking politically, specifically politically about this issue, is a society in which the capacity for argumentation is greatly lessened. Right, in which you're where it's, you know, people like to complain about sound bites, and it almost feels like a cliche to complain about it. And I might clip this tiny little bit.
I was just about to say, we need to clip this.
But you know, that seems to me one consequence. But Derick, when do you come in on this?
I'll give you an anecdote, and then I'll talk a little bit more. I had a student who found my podcast project on YouTube, and told me they would love to listen to it, but even the short 15-minute videos were way too long for them. This was an honor student. Now, to bring that up, we don't have a model for orality without memory.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage magazine with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of bunga bunga.
De A ou pas se taire.